For years, investigators listened to the recording and heard nothing useful. They didn't realize the problem wasn't the message. It was the way they were listening. Initial conclusions were accepted and the case was set aside. Investigators worked within the conclusion that the available evidence had reached its limit. The scene had been processed, interviews conducted, and physical material collected and tested using the standards available at the time. Those efforts did not produce a suspect who could be formally charged. The audio material recovered early on was reviewed and judged unclear, offering no reliable detail that could support further action. With no eyewitness account, no confession, and no forensic result that met prosecutorial thresholds, the case lacked a path forward. Resources were gradually redirected to investigations with clearer leads and a higher likelihood of resolution. The file remained open but inactive, preserved for reference rather than active pursuit. From an institutional standpoint, the investigation had not failed. It had simply reached a point where existing methods could no longer move it ahead. Despite the prevailing assessment, certain elements remained unresolved. A recorded audio file existed that could not be fully interpreted using standard review methods. Its origin was documented, but its content could not be reliably extracted. Analysts confirmed the file was authentic and unaltered, yet no clear speech or actionable detail could be identified. The material was neither dismissed nor prioritized. It remained archived with the rest of the evidence. The timing associated with the recording did not align cleanly with other known activity. That discrepancy was noted but not treated as determinative. Background sounds were present but indistinct. No consensus could be reached about what environment they represented. Multiple reviews reached the same conclusion. The file did not meet evidentiary standards for use. Separately, physical evidence collected at the scene did not yield results that met identification thresholds at the time. Laboratory testing was completed, but the outcomes were partial and inconclusive. None of these elements contradicted the official understanding. They also did not reinforce it. Each remained intact, documented, and unresolved. The case rested not on missing evidence, but on evidence that could not yet speak with clarity. If you are listening from somewhere today, you can note where that is. And now, here is what happened to Faith Hedgepeth. The victim was Faith Danielle Hedgepeth, a 19-year-old student enrolled at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She was a sophomore at the time, pursuing studies in education. Faith lived in an off-campus apartment in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which she shared with a roommate. The apartment was located in a residential complex commonly occupied by students and young adults. On the evening of the 6th of September 2012, Faith spent time with friends. Later that night, and into the early morning hours of September 7, she and her roommate went to a local nightclub in Chapel Hill. Surveillance footage and witness accounts later established that they were present at the venue during that period. They left separately in the early morning hours. Faith returned to the apartment alone. The apartment showed no signs of forced entry when it was later examined. Items inside were not reported missing in a way that immediately suggested a burglary. Faith's roommate returned later in the morning of September 7 and discovered Faith unresponsive in her bedroom. Emergency services were contacted. Faith was pronounced dead at the scene. Law enforcement officers from the Chapel Hill Police Department secured the apartment and initiated an investigation. The scene was processed according to standard procedure. Physical evidence was collected from multiple areas within the residence, including the bedroom where Faith was found. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma. The investigation proceeded as a homicide inquiry from the outset. At the time, investigators focused on reconstructing Faith's movements during the hours leading up to her death. Interviews were conducted with friends, acquaintances, and individuals who had contact with her in the days immediately before September 7. Law enforcement also reviewed surveillance footage from nearby locations, including the nightclub and surrounding streets. Phone records were obtained to establish communication patterns. Investigators considered several working theories based on the information available. One line of inquiry centered on the possibility that Faith knew the person responsible, given the absence of forced entry. Another theory considered whether the incident could have involved a dispute that escalated inside the apartment. These were investigative frameworks rather than conclusions, and guided the early direction of interviews and evidence review. Digital evidence formed part of the case file. Faith's phone activity, including calls and messages, was documented. A voicemail recording associated with Faith's phone was identified and preserved. At the time, the recording could not be clearly interpreted using standard analytical methods. It was cataloged with other evidence and retained for reference. Forensic testing was conducted on biological material recovered from the scene. Laboratory analysis followed the protocols and technological standards available in 2012. The results did not immediately produce an identification that met legal thresholds. Partial profiles were documented and retained. No arrest was made during this phase of the investigation. The university community and the city of Chapel Hill were notified of the homicide. Law enforcement provided limited public updates, confirming the death and stating that the investigation was ongoing. Officials did not release specific details that could compromise the inquiry. Tips from the public were received and logged. Throughout the months that followed, the case remained open. Investigators continued to review evidence and follow up on information as it became available. The focus stayed on documented facts, the timeline of the night, the physical scene, and the material evidence collected. No suspect was publicly identified during this period. From an institutional perspective, the investigation reflected the constraints of the time. The case relied on physical evidence, witness statements, and forensic testing as they existed in the early 2010 seconds. Decisions were made based on what could be established and supported. Evidence that did not produce clear results was preserved rather than discarded. By the end of the initial investigative phase, the case had not advanced to an arrest or formal charge. The file remained active but without new actionable leads. Faith Hedgepeth's death was recorded as an unsolved homicide, with all collected material retained for future review. The investigation into the death of Faith Hedgepeth was initiated immediately after the scene was secured on the 7th of September 2012. The Chapel Hill Police Department treated the case as a homicide from the outset and assigned detectives with experience in violent crime. The early phase focused on preservation, documentation, and reconstruction rather than attribution of guilt. The apartment was processed using standard crime scene procedures in place at the time. Investigators documented the layout of the residence, photographed relevant areas, and collected physical material that could hold forensic value. This included biological samples, personal items, and materials from the bedroom where Faith was found. No signs of forced entry were identified, a detail that influenced how the investigation was framed but did not narrow it to a specific individual. An autopsy was conducted by the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma. The manner of death was classified as homicide. Findings from the autopsy were incorporated into the investigative file and used to guide subsequent forensic testing and interview strategies. Detectives began reconstructing the timeline of the hours preceding Faith's death. This involved reviewing surveillance footage from locations she had visited, including a nightclub in Chapel Hill. Video records helped establish her presence at the venue and her departure time. Investigators also examined footage from nearby streets and residential areas to identify any relevant movement patterns. At the time, available camera coverage was limited in scope and resolution, which constrained how precisely movements could be tracked. Witness interviews formed a major component of the investigation. Friends, acquaintances, and individuals who had interacted with Faith in the days before her death were interviewed. These interviews aimed to establish routine behavior, recent interactions, and any potential disputes or concerns. Statements were compared for consistency and cross-referenced with digital records where possible. No witness provided information that directly identified a suspect or placed a specific individual at the apartment during the relevant time window. Phone records were obtained through legal process. Investigators reviewed call logs, text messages, and voicemail data associated with Faith's phone. This review included a voicemail recording that had been inadvertently created earlier that night. The recording was preserved and analyzed. At the time, standard audio review methods did not allow investigators to extract clear or reliable content from the file. As a result, it could not be used to support further investigative action. The recording was retained as evidence rather than excluded. Digital forensics in 2012 operated within narrower technical limits than those available in later years. Data extraction, enhancement, and analysis tools were less advanced, particularly for degraded or low-quality audio and partial biological samples. Investigators relied on established laboratory processes and avoided interpretive conclusions that could not be independently validated. Forensic testing was conducted on biological material recovered from the scene. This included DNA analysis, using the methods available at the time. The results produced partial profiles that could not be matched to a known individual in law enforcement databases. These outcomes were documented and stored. The absence of a database match was not treated as a failure, but as a reflection of the limits of available reference data and analytical sensitivity. Investigators also evaluated the possibility that the individual responsible was known to the victim. This line of reasoning was based on the lack of forced entry in the context of the scene. Interviews and background checks were conducted accordingly. These inquiries did not yield evidence sufficient to support an arrest or charge. No individual was publicly named as a suspect during this period. Throughout the investigation, decisions were guided by prosecutorial standards. Detectives coordinated with prosecutors to assess whether the available evidence met the threshold for legal action. Without a suspect linked by physical evidence, credible witness testimony, or confession, the case could not advance to prosecution. This assessment influenced how resources were allocated over time. The case remained open, but as months passed without new leads, active investigative efforts slowed. This shift did not reflect abandonment. Evidence was cataloged, preserved, and periodically reviewed. The file remained accessible for future examination should new information or methods become available. Public communication was measured. Law enforcement released limited details, confirming the homicide and requesting information from the public without disclosing sensitive evidence. Tips were received and evaluated. None resulted in a verifiable lead that could be pursued further. Importantly, the decisions made during this phase must be understood within the context of the period. Certain forms of analysis that later became standard were not yet reliable or widely adopted. The inability to extract actionable detail from specific evidence was not the result of oversight, but of technological constraint. Where evidence could not be interpreted with confidence, investigators chose preservation over conjecture. By the conclusion of the initial investigative phase, the case had not reached resolution. No suspect had been charged. No evidence had been excluded or destroyed. The investigation transitioned into a dormant state, with the understanding that advances in forensic science or the emergence of new information could justify renewed review. By the end of the initial phase, the case was defined less by missing evidence than by evidence that could not yet produce an identification. The material that mattered most was biological evidence collected during the original scene processing and medical examination. Investigators documented semen and male DNA associated with the homicide, and they treated that DNA as a potential identifier from the beginning. In cases like this, the central forensic method is comparative DNA identification. It is not a single test. It is a sequence of steps that begins with collecting biological material and ends, if conditions allow, with a defensible match to a specific person. The first step is extraction. A laboratory receives swabs or samples and uses chemical processes to separate DNA from the rest of the material. If the sample is limited, degraded, or mixed with DNA from more than one person, the lab may only recover a partial profile. That does not make it unusable, but it does restrict what it can confidently say. The second step is profiling. For most criminal investigations in the United States during the 2010 seconds, the standard profile used for comparison was based on STR markers, short repeated segments of DNA that vary from person to person. The lab measures these markers at multiple locations in the genome and produces a profile that can be compared to reference samples. When a profile is partial, the match power drops. When it is mixed, interpretation becomes more cautious, and thresholds are applied to avoid reading noise as a signal. The third step is database comparison. If the profile meets quality and eligibility standards, it can be searched against a law enforcement database of known offenders and arrestees. In the United States, this is often discussed in public reporting as a CODIS hit, though agencies do not always confirm the specific database pathway in real time. What matters method-wise is simple. A crime scene profile can only match someone already represented in the database. When it does not, the lack of a match does not clear anyone outside the system. It only means the database did not contain the person responsible at that moment. This case followed that reality for years. Investigators had male DNA associated with the crime scene, but no name attached to it. The result was an investigation that could eliminate people who provided reference samples and did not match, but could not identify the contributor without either a database match or another reliable pathway. Over time, as the case remained open, the method shifted from a single attempt at identification to a long-term preservation strategy. The evidence was retained so it could be retested as laboratory sensitivity improved and as databases expanded. That is not a dramatic process. It is administrative discipline and chain of custody continuity. Each retest depends on whether enough sample remains and whether the sample can withstand additional consumption. Later reporting and court filings in this case show exactly how that limitation can surface. Some evidence cannot be reworked indefinitely because testing consumes material. There was also a second, separate category of method that ran alongside DNA testing: physical impression evidence. Court reporting on this case later referenced a palm print comparison tied to the suspected murder weapon. While DNA can identify biological contact, prints can speak to handling. The forensic approach is parallel. Collect, preserve, compare to known standards, and evaluate whether the match meets accepted criteria. When prints are partial, smudged, or on curved or textured surfaces, the clarity can be limited. The method remains the same, but the strength of the conclusion depends on the quality of the impression and the clarity of the reference print. Court document reporting described both DNA and a palm print match as part of the identification framework after the arrest. The most consequential methodological turn in this case did not come from a new theory of what happened. It came from how investigators obtained a valid reference sample that could be compared to the preserved profile. According to court document reporting, investigators covertly obtained DNA from the eventual suspect during a DWI traffic stop, without his consent, shortly before the public announcement of the arrest. This matters because it shows a specific investigative technique. When police have lawful cause and an investigative need, they may collect a discarded DNA sample. The principle is that DNA left behind on an object a person abandons in public, such as a cup or cigarette, can be collected and tested. The legality can vary by jurisdiction and by the facts of the collection, but the operational aim is consistent. Obtain a reference sample without alerting the subject, then compare it to the crime scene DNA. Once a reference sample is obtained, the laboratory phase becomes a confirmation process. The lab compares the reference profile to the crime scene profile. If the profiles align across the tested markers and meet the statistical thresholds used by the laboratory, investigators treat it as a lead strong enough to support further action, often including search warrants and, in some circumstances, an arrest warrant. In this case, reporting tied to court documents indicates that the match process was not limited to one item of evidence. The public narrative that emerged after the arrest described DNA linking the suspect to the crime scene, and later reporting described additional charges and allegations that were consistent with a sexual assault component, aligning with earlier reporting that semen was present. This is where the method becomes more than one match. A careful investigation does not stop at the DNA matches. Investigators then attempt to test whether other evidence coheres with the same identification. That is corroboration, not embellishment. Corroboration can take several forms. It can be additional forensic comparisons, such as the palm print comparison referenced in court document reporting. It can also be location and timeline work, such as establishing whether the identified individual can be placed in the relevant geography and time window. It can include interviews, prior contacts, records, and other legally obtained material that either strengthens or weakens the identification. In long-running cases, corroboration also includes guarding against a specific risk, mistaking a partial, mixed, or degraded profile as definitive when it is not. That is why laboratories use thresholds, replication, and documentation. It is also why prosecutors will often seek multiple lines of support before moving forward on major charges. The technique used here, as described by court document reporting, highlights a practical truth of modern cold case work. Sometimes the forensic capability existed earlier, but the missing piece was access to a comparable reference sample that could lawfully be obtained and tested. Once that reference sample is in hand, the older evidence can be reread in a more decisive way, not because the facts changed, but because comparison became possible. This is also the right place to separate method from myth. The well-known voicemail in this case generated public attention and later expert interpretation, but the arrest pathway described in later reporting is anchored in forensic identification, not audio interpretation. The difference matters. Audio enhancement can suggest possibilities. DNA comparison, when properly obtained, validated, and documented, can support legal action. By 2024, prosecutors amended or expanded the charging framework to include additional offenses tied to the same event, according to later reporting. In 2025, further motions and filings continued to surface in local coverage, reflecting the reality that complex homicide prosecutions can continue evolving long after an arrest, particularly when evidentiary disputes and procedural questions are litigated in court. So the method, in its complete form, is not a single breakthrough, it is a chain. Evidence is collected and preserved early. A DNA profile is generated from biological material. The profile is searched and does not match anyone available. The investigation continues through elimination and documentation. Years later, a lawful reference sample is obtained. The reference profile is compared to the preserved profile. The match is evaluated using laboratory standards. Additional evidence is checked for coherence, including impression evidence referenced in court reporting. An arrest and expanded charges follow only after that chain is strong enough to move from suspicion to formal accusation. That is how cold cases often become solvable. Not through a new story, but through a comparison that was not possible before. The turning point did not begin with a new witness or a revised theory. It began with a procedural decision to re-engage preserved evidence using updated investigative options. By the late 2010 seconds, advances in forensic science and expanded reference databases allowed investigators to reconsider material that had remained unresolved for years. The key step was not reinterpreting the crime scene, but obtaining a lawful reference point for comparison. Investigators focused on identifying individuals whose DNA was not previously available in any database. This required a careful review of prior eliminations, known associates, and investigative tips that had not produced results earlier. The aim was not to reopen the case broadly, but to narrow the field in a controlled, evidence-driven way. Once a potential individual of interest was identified, investigators pursued a method commonly used in long-running cases: the collection of a discarded DNA sample. This approach relies on the principle that biological material voluntarily left behind in a public setting can be collected without direct contact or notification. The collection itself does not establish guilt. It creates a reference sample. That reference sample was submitted for laboratory analysis and compared against the preserved biological evidence from the crime scene. The comparison followed standard forensic protocols. Analysts examined whether the profiles aligned across tested markers and whether the statistical strength of the match met accepted thresholds. This was not a single-step determination. It involved verification, documentation, and internal review. The comparison produced a result that had not been possible earlier. The preserved profile, which had remained unidentified for years, now aligned with a specific individual. This did not immediately conclude the investigation. Instead, it triggered a secondary phase focused on corroboration. Investigators reviewed whether other elements of the case were consistent with this identification. This included reassessing physical evidence, reviewing prior statements, and confirming whether the individual could be placed within the relevant time frame and geographic context. The process was incremental and cautious. No public announcement was made at this stage. Only after the forensic findings were reviewed alongside corroborating material did investigators determine that the evidence met the standard required to proceed. The breakthrough was not the discovery of new evidence, but the ability to interpret existing evidence through a comparison that had not previously been available. What changed was not the facts of the case. What changed was the capacity to connect them. In September 2021, law enforcement authorities announced the arrest of a suspect in connection with the homicide of Faith Hedgepeth. The individual identified was Rosendo Rodriguez Jr., a resident of North Carolina. He was charged with first-degree murder. Court documents indicated that the arrest was based primarily on forensic evidence. Investigators alleged that DNA collected from the crime scene matched a reference sample obtained from Rodriguez. The match was presented as the central basis for probable cause. Authorities also cited additional forensic comparisons, including physical impression evidence, as supporting material. Following the arrest, Rodriguez was taken into custody and held without bond. Law enforcement officials stated that the case remained active and that further investigation was ongoing. They emphasized that the arrest resulted from a combination of preserved evidence, updated forensic methods, and continued review rather than new witness testimony. In December 2021, prosecutors announced an additional charge of first-degree rape related to the same incident. This charge was also tied to forensic findings documented in court filings. The legal process proceeded through pre-trial motions and evidentiary hearings, during which defense counsel challenged aspects of the forensic analysis and the methods used to obtain reference samples. In 2023, the case advanced toward trial. Court proceedings focused on the admissibility and interpretation of forensic evidence, including DNA analysis. In 2024, prosecutors filed additional motions refining the scope of the charges and the evidence to be presented. As of the most recent verified court records, the case has not concluded with a verdict. The outcome remains subject to judicial determination. No conviction has been entered, and the defendant maintains a plea of not guilty. The documented outcome, therefore, is not a resolution in the sense of closure, but a transition. An unsolved homicide moved into formal adjudication. Evidence preserved years earlier became the basis for criminal charges, once comparison became possible. The process shifted from investigation to prosecution, where the evaluation of that evidence now rests with the court. This case illustrates how the passage of time interacts with method rather than meaning. The evidence did not change. It remained preserved, cataloged, and constrained by the same facts that existed from the beginning. What changed was the ability to compare, to test, and to connect that evidence within an expanded forensic framework. The investigation did not advance through reinterpretation or revision of events. It advanced through restraint. Decisions made early in the case emphasized documentation over assumption and preservation over pressure to conclude. That discipline allowed the material to remain usable when technology and access evolved. Patience, in this context, was not inactivity. It was continuity. Each stage relied on maintaining standards that would hold years later under legal review. When comparison finally became possible, it was effective because earlier steps had avoided overreach. Justice, here, is procedural rather than emotional. It rests on whether evidence can be examined, challenged, and weighed within a courtroom. The role of investigators was not to produce certainty, but to preserve the conditions under which certainty could later be tested. This case demonstrates that resolution in long investigations is often a function of readiness rather than revelation. The outcome depended on the decision to keep evidence intact and to return to it when method allowed, not on discovering something new, but on finally being able to measure what had always been there. Where are you listening from today? If careful, method-driven investigations matter to you, you can follow this series for more cases examined with time, evidence, and restraint.